Thank you so much. As someone who's totally occupied with my research on urban heritage, it's really a true pleasure for me to chair this session and present our three speakers rather quickly. You have the full bios in the booklet, so we're trying to save the time for debates. Our first speaker is Susan Harris, who will talk about politics of urban recovery. And our second speaker is Rohit Giasso, who will talk about resilience, challenges, and opportunities for post-crisis recovery. And I think here we'll have a more global view. And then last presentation by Chiara De Cesari on restoring the past, claiming rights in the present. So, which will be on Hebron, which is very important, the one paper on Palestine that will talk about contestation of heritage. So with that, I'd like to ask, please, Susan, to start the panel.
Great. That's great. Okay, everyone can hear me? So first, thank you so much to the conference organizers for such a fantastic event and for inviting me. Today I'm going to share with you some research that I've been doing with a Georgian colleague of mine, David Sichinava, and we're looking at the urban recovery processes of a Georgian resort town called Skaltubo. In reading the concept note for the city debates, I was particularly captivated by this idea of reconsidering the intersections between displacement and reconstruction, which is exactly what we're trying to do in this work. And if a lot of work looking at post-conflict reconstruction tends to focus on the post-conflict areas themselves and how they're getting rebuilt, we wanted to look a little bit more at what happens to the places of humanitarian shelter where the displaced were formerly living. So in situations of displacement where the displaced communities find shelters in existing cities and towns, there's a lot of interesting overlaps between sites of possible urban renewal and protracted displacement. And these overlaps sort of link to a different side of conflict-related reconstruction. And so specifically, our work is looking at and unpacking the politics of urban recovery as they appear in heritage sites also serving as temporary humanitarian shelters in Georgia. And so for those of you a little bit less familiar with the geography of Georgia, the town of Skaltubo, which you see in blue here, is located in the west of Georgia. Georgia's south of Russia, close to Turkey on the Black Sea. So in February 2018, the Georgian Ministry of Culture proposed placing 14 spa resort buildings in the small town of Skaltubo on a National Heritage Protection List. Spanning the early decades of the 20th century Stalinist era, the buildings reflect a unique moment in the development history of the town and are indicative of the spread of vacation culture around spa health treatments in the Soviet Union more broadly. Yet with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the tourist industry had faltered, leaving behind thousands of unused guest rooms and resort facilities. Skaltubo's annual population of vacationers fell from 125,000 in 1989 to under 100 by the mid-1990s. And after decades of physical deterioration and partial closure, as of 2016, the historic bathhouses and hotels, the hotels are referred to as sanatoria, are again being positioned for tourism, recalling the sort of zenith of the town as one of the most sought-after wellness destinations in the region during the Soviet era. And yet today's urban regeneration topics are facing additional challenges. In the fall of 1992, less than a year and a half after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the sanatoria of Skaltubo were again being filled with new occupants. This time, it was some 8,000 internally displaced persons seeking refuge from conflict in the nearby secessionist region of Abkhazia. Almost 3 decades later, today, Skaltubo sanatoria remain filled with some of these inhabitants. They're using them as their protracted de facto homes. And if the resort facilities are to be renovated, they're going to have to look at how these inhabitants can be resettled. And something that's important to note when we're thinking about this kind of idea of the heritage identity of the town is just how long these buildings have been serving these alternative uses. Built in the latter half of the 20th century, the sanatoria of Skaltubo now equally have spent their lives as resort complexes and as spaces of humanitarian shelter. And as sites of dual memory, the sanatoria embody these sort of divergent histories of the town, the tourism and the displacement aspects of that past, while further reflecting some of the political economic upheavals that caused this transition in history. And so what's to be made of this history and how it's changing in Skaltubo? Well, we argue that the state's efforts towards urban recovery are selectively reframing the history of the town on two fronts. And the first is the reframing of the town's Soviet-era history to show communist health procedures as contemporary luxury tourist experiences for a new international capitalist audience. And second is the absence of the IDP's narratives. There's no sense of their narratives in the urban recovery efforts, and no sense of a history in exile. And given the nature of this panel, I'll focus a little bit more on that second part. Before getting into the specifics of Skaltubo, I thought it might help to just situate the research a little bit within existing literature. So various scholars have shown how heritage has been commodified for tourism and how this commodification can result in the select retelling of place histories. For example, Nezar al-Sayad notes that in today's world where the global heritage industry reigns supreme, the notion of authenticity has sometimes been cut completely loose from its moorings. The image of the thing may now actually replace the thing itself. Gregory Ashworth and Peter Larkham further remind us that rather than a testament of the past, heritage is a contemporary commodity purposefully created to satisfy contemporary consumption. Heritage-related tourism has also been shown to have an uneasy relationship with displacement. Across the globe, there's examples of local populations being evicted in order to resuscitate heritage for tourism. Looking at the Indian government's desires to attain UNESCO World Heritage status at a medieval Hindu empire site, Natalie Block shows how local farmers were evicted from the village of Hampi. Andrew Herscher and Daniel Bertrand Monk explain how heritage transformations in the walled citadel of Erbil, Iraq, led to the removal of hundreds of Iraqi refugees and IDPs. And Robert Shepard tells of how tourism to the sacred Buddhist site of Wutaishan in China also led to community displacement and the selective retelling of history. So the Georgian government's desires to resettle IDPs in Skaltubo should perhaps be considered relative to some of these global trends. In contrast to the value placed on the sort of tourism commodity of heritage in cities, urban scholars Alessandro Petti and Sandy Halal have argued for an acknowledgement of a community-driven form of heritage. Sort of in relation to displaced communities, this is what they're calling refugee heritage, and it looks at commemorating the life lived in exile. And I think this is important for considering the history of IDPs in Skaltubo when thinking about urban recovery. So now I'll just dive directly into some info about the Skaltubo case for time's sake. I'll first provide just a really quick summary of the town and discuss how its history is being selectively reframed as part of this heritage tourism repromotion. And I'll also show some aspects of local alternative IDP histories that have been emerging and what might be lost in this process of urban recovery. The findings for this work is coming from a bunch of research that we collected through mixed methods. It combines archival research with in-depth interviews, participant observation, and 8 focus groups conducted with both local residents and IDPs. So the settlement of Skaltubo has deep roots in its geographic location on top of these radon-carbonated natural springs in the west of Georgia. In 1931, it became an officially designated Soviet resort town. Its 1936 Soviet development scheme envisioned a centrally located lush park space, which you can see sort of in the middle of the image, which would house 10 of the actual bathhouses where you would go for these treatments. And then on the periphery around them would be a ring of 22 hotel sanatoria, and that was planned to create this sort of layout of an urban amphitheater for the resort spaces. Throughout the Soviet era, the landscape of the Caucasus Mountains in particular had been a lively destination for communist-related health procedures right up to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's important to note that the guest experience at a Soviet sanatoria is quite different than what we might be imagining when we think of a contemporary luxury spa resort. Rather than today's emphasis on pampering and relaxation, the daily routines of Soviet guests were to a large extent filled with medical treatments and structured around physical activities, like the one you're seeing here. The sanatoria were intended to provide recuperation, particularly for workers that were in industrial factories, mines, or serving time in the military. Some of Skaltubo's primary sanatoria, for example, were designed exclusively for use by government ministries, trade unions, and members of the KGB. With restricted access, these sanatoria were administered through all union institutions that managed employment in the USSR. So this first way that we see urban recovery selectively reframing the history of Skaltubo today is with regards to its pedigree as a Soviet-era resort destination and a place for restorative health procedures. The tourism agenda that we see being pushed today is quite different from what we just saw in those sort of medically centered procedures in the former slides. The government's technical proposal for redevelopment states that the tourism should sort of play off this history as being one of the best and famous USSR resort locations, but that it should then sort of manipulate that into medical and wellness spa capital of Eastern Europe. And these changes can already be seen in the developments starting to take place in the town. The former Ministry of Defense sanatoria, for example, has been completely rebranded as the 4-star Legends Skaltubo Spa Resort Hotel, hosting medical tourists as well as large groups of weddings and other parties. Tourism advertising for the resort highlights its pedigree as a place once home to the prominent bathhouses of Joseph Stalin. It further promises access to the 21st century's best medical treatments. And just in a quick comparison of today's marketing material to the archival photos, you can see this kind of reinterpretation of the town's history. So we see on the right this quite structured Soviet group therapy being replaced with images of personal relaxation and luxury on the left. And in this image, you can even see standing off to the side as a sort of medical practitioner guiding the session of what was called underwater physical therapy. So the second way in which we see urban recovery selectively reframing the history of Skaltubo today is with regards to the absence of the IDP's narratives from the urban redevelopment and a lack of acknowledgement of the value that might be present in their histories in exile. With the arrivals of IDPs in 1992, life in Skaltubo took on a very different character. The seasonal influx of foreign tourists was replaced with a stable population of culturally and religiously similar ethnic Georgians. The socioeconomic composition of the town also changed dramatically. Many of the IDPs had to leave everything behind and thus were not as socioeconomically well off as they had been previously. The arriving IDPs also had filled this tremendous void in the town, which was felt through the absence of those thousands of tourists. In efforts to establish some semblance of a local life, they began augmenting the sanatoria buildings to support their needs, sometimes to dramatic degrees, and this ties into the presentation we saw this morning. You see the addition or removal of walls, the enclosure of balconies, and the transformation of internal spaces because these buildings really aren't built for residential and habitation. And even on the grounds of the property, there would be an agricultural and animal husbandry introduced at times. In the focus group discussions with IDPs, we learned how the sanatoria have come to support a sort of entirely different lifestyle than that had been previously experienced when it was a tourist resort. IDP focus groups, their participants were telling us that while there were everyday hardships, there was a sense of community which had emerged among the sanatoria's residents. They were producing their own histories in exile. And they had also forged connections with the local residents community and the sort of positive resilience that Diane was talking about yesterday, the horizontal alignments across communities. And even when the residents were perhaps critical of the physical conditions of their dwellings, they showed fondness for the town's spaces itself and its sense of local community. The sanatoria had therefore become spaces which helped to reform the sense of post-communist identity and community in Skaltovo. Even after some of the IDPs were resettled to other areas of Georgia into new purpose-built collective centers, they've since tried to keep local connections alive. And some of the former residents of two of the sanatoria, the Kolheti and Galati sanatoria, have come back on a monthly basis to participate in these kind of community gatherings. And those are attended from IDPs from all across the west of the country. So Skaltubo sanatoria are therefore unique in how they're embodying this dual history. And it's a history that is perhaps now at risk of partial erasure in these efforts towards urban recovery. And so to summarize some of our research findings as they relate to these concepts of displacement and urban renewal, through the focus groups, we found that most IDPs do have this strong connection to Skaltubo and want to be resettled, but they'd like to do so in new buildings in the immediate vicinity. A lot of the IDPs do not want to live in the same Soviet-era resort buildings because of their poor physical condition, for one, but also because of this sort of stigma of not inhabiting a residential building. And that stigma also ties into the IDPs feeling like outsiders, even though they're within their own country. Both IDPs and local residents mentioned the importance of acknowledging the town's history of displacement, yet still described the town's resort era as its sort of official history, which raises some interesting questions about the ways we acknowledge the past in our built environment. And also makes you wonder if the architectural and aesthetic aspects of the buildings ideologically anchor them to only that one period in history. And IDPs are divided about whether or not the state should officially commemorate their histories of exile in the town. There's a feeling that this might further differentiate them from the rest of the community and their capacity to integrate locally. And interestingly, in the focus groups with local residents, there was a sense that they were in favor of commemorating this history of IDPs in the town, but they felt that it also needed to highlight their sacrifices as a host community, which also points to this sort of additional layer of local histories and how there might be some negotiations that need to take place between the different populations about what is that narrative of the past and how did it play out locally. But in contrast to our findings, unfortunately, the government's ambitious plans to redevelop the town don't really recognize any value of IDP histories as they've taken place in exile. The government report on urban regeneration does say that there's a problem with IDPs and it has to be resolved, and that there may be different possibilities in the town or more outside of the resort. But they don't really specifically divulge how they'll be accommodated, where, and there's definitely no mention of sort of commemorating what that life in between might have been and how that shaped the kind of place meanings of the town. So in thinking of some implications of this research on issues of local urban recovery, in terms of the displacement aspect of it, it obviously seems that if the IDPs would like to resettle locally in proximity to these spaces, that should be recognized or should at least be part of the discussions when talking about their resettlement. In doing so, there might even be a way to kind of keep these dual narratives in tension with one another instead of completely rewriting one history. But more broadly speaking, the challenges of displacement coming together with urban renewal warrant discussion for the implications in this field of heritage tourism. And across the globe, as we saw, there's this sense of displaced communities increasingly finding refuge in existing towns and cities, and with that comes the increased risk of heritage preservation or spaces of heritage coming up against the place meanings of these areas. In thinking about how to preserve and acknowledge the heritage of our cities, it's raising important questions then about whose heritage is getting preserved and which periods carry more value. And some additional points that we're exploring in this research that I haven't had the time to fully unpack here, but I think they'd be great to pick up on in a discussion, is if the local IDPs have a sort of ambivalence about preserving their history in the sanatoria buildings, who are the stewards of this place meaning? And I've framed this erasure of the humanitarian side of Skaltubo's history as a sort of loss of place meaning, but perhaps it could equally be considered as an act of therapeutic mass forgetting or sort of moving forward. If displaced residents don't want to commemorate their histories in exile, are there grounds for outside claims to do so? Many IDPs see the return of local tourism in this really utopic manner, providing jobs and restoring the town's fame. And this raises some questions about the propaganda power of urban regeneration schemes, and I think touches upon some of those temporality discussions we've had about the either nostalgia for the past and a sense of return, or the projection onto the future and what that might offer, rather than the kind of concrete proof of what's possible within the means of the development of the city. And on a kind of regional level, across Georgia, almost all communist-era history is being erased, particularly history in the built environment. And so the case of Skaltubo is actually quite unique in that this history is being preserved and exploited. It raises some questions about whether or not there could be a kind of unintentional productive aspect of that in keeping some of this history alive for heritage, maybe it's not erasing all Soviet history. So to conclude, despite these sort of ambitious plans to redevelop the town, there are a number of cautionary notes regarding the erasure of the place histories and this commodification of heritage that's taking place. And aside from this select reflaming of the Soviet-era health practices for a kind of new luxury spa culture, there's these narratives of the IDPs and their history. With the government's use of heritage as a catalyst, basically, for urban development, we only see this one narrative being pushed and sort of manipulated to their needs. So I look forward to hearing any comments or thoughts you might have, because this is still a work in progress. And thank you very much.